A human being who's being him or herself is captivating. And that alone, just hearing somebody be themselves, will grab everyone's attention. There's a problem if people are embarrassed to be themselves. Then they can actually become so contained that people can't access them. And okay, that's boring because there's no one there. But if you'll allow people to be themselves, to really like let loose and be themselves, ain't more interesting than that. That's like as good as it gets.
I was first introduced to Rabbi Leib Kelemen through his iconic books Permission to Believe and Permission to Receive, which I read back in 1999 when I first got to Or Sameach in Yerushalayim. These two books, the one with a bright red cover and the one with a bright blue cover, set out to prove that A, the world has a creator, and B, that the Torah is of divine origin. I remember being so blown away by Rabbi Kelemen's arguments that I immediately ran out and bought several copies of his books and mailed them to my friends back home, thinking that if they just read these two books, then they'd understand why I dropped everything to go study Torah in Israel, and they would be so compelled by the truth of what he was saying that they'd do the same. Well, needless to say, that didn't happen. That was 25 years ago. But now, Rabbi Kelemen has a new book out. It's called Questions and Answers with Rabbi Leib Kelemen, and it's 100 of the most frequently asked questions that were posed to him over the years, and his best, most well-thought-out and transformative answers to them in a book. I started reading it over Shabbos last week, and it is really, really good. And the funny thing is, there are not a lot of chidushim in here. Most of the stuff he says I already knew, but it's the way that Rabbi Kelemen says it. He's a master of metaphors, a modern-day Maggid, who somehow always seems to have the best mashal at his fingertips to illustrate his point. And he's really great at taking something abstract and esoteric and making it really meaningful and relevant. Listen to this example, which he uses to illustrate the difference between knowing something intellectually and really believing it with all your heart.
There's a story, I'll give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. There's a story about a fellow who was about to attempt suicide. And he was standing mamash outside the window when a talented social worker who was part of the police unit for dealing with suicides showed up. And the police and the police psychologist had already failed to talk the person off the edge. And the social worker walked in, understood the situation. She was very clever. She said, just keep him from jumping for another 10 minutes. And she left the room. She came back 10 minutes later with a watermelon. She leaned out the window. She said, excuse me. And she dropped the watermelon. And the guy came back in.
After our interview, I found myself wanting to hear more from him. So I went online and listened to a few unbelievable talks of his. Probably the most famous lecture Rabbi Kelemen has ever delivered is called We Are Never Alone. It's the riveting story about his son, who was born with something like 1 in a million chance of survival, and the incredible hashgacha pratis chain of events that all had to align in order for Rabbi Kelemen's child to receive the operation that would save his life.
So I stepped up to the wall that morning in Sharet Tzedek, and it was the most unusual tefillah I had ever had. And it's the most unusual tefillah I've had since then. What happened was I stepped up to the wall and I just started praying, God, save my kid, please. And it was the first time ever in my life that I had absolute and total clarity. I mean, I really knew that there was no one listening. It was the first time I realized I had been completely abandoned. If there was a God, he wasn't there listening to my prayers. I was totally alone. It was a palpable feeling of complete abandonment.
I remember hearing that story 25 years ago. Rabbi Kelemen would become so animated while telling it, he'd leap onto tables in the middle of his lecture. I just re-listened to it last month while I was driving back from the RCA conference, and it's just riveting and really, really thought-provoking. And we talk about it in our interview. If you haven't heard it, Google it right now and bookmark it to listen for later. It's called We Are Never Alone. And there's another one you really have to hear. It's called Defining Love. I actually had to pull over on the side of the highway while listening to it to process what Rabbi Kelemen was saying because the implications were so life-changing. So if you couldn't tell by now, I'm a huge fan of Rabbi Leib Kelemen, and I feel so lucky to have gotten an hour of his time where he shared with me his speaking process and how he prepares future leaders of Klal Yisrael to communicate.
This is so powerful, your question. The whole discussion between you and me today was worth it for that question.
In part one, we talk about the rigorous amount of preparation he requires the students to commit to before ever getting up to speak in public.
So before any of our guys gets up to speak, they have to be able to look me in the face and say that I spent more than 40 hours. That's the magic number. I spent more than 40 hours researching this particular vort that I'm going to give over.
The intention is that they should become one with their message and deliver it in a way that cuts straight through to their audience's heart, grabs their attention and holds it, and makes a memorable impact. Part 2 is where we discuss the high premium that Rabbi Kelemen places on being a unique speaker and giving the audience the one thing they can't get anywhere else, you.
I would be very, very upset if two of our guys ended up with the same speaking style, and so far that has not happened once. And I've run dozens of guys through our program. I've never had two guys who came out with the same speaking style, and I'm very, very proud of that.
We also talk about Rabbi Kelemen's mentor, the late Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe, and his one-of-a-kind speaking style. Here's where we also discuss how to manage shrinking attention spans and the need for a strong call to action at the end of every Torah presentation. And lastly, in part 3, we get into how a speaker's ability to communicate effectively largely depends on them having a strong sense of will. Weak-willed people always struggle with this. And Rabbi Kelemen shares with us his method for how a person can go about developing a strong sense of will if they haven't yet worked on it. After the interview, be sure to visit Rabbi Kelemen's website, lawrencekelemen.com, that's Kelemen.com, and look for his new book on the ArtScroll website, Questions and Answers with Rabbi Leib Kelemen. I learned so much from my conversation with Rabbi Leib Kelemen, and I'm sure you will too. So now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Leib Kelemen.
There we go.
Hi, Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
Thank you so much for making the time for this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Curious, I saw that you used to be a news anchor at some point. Has that influenced any way in which you impart information in public settings?
Probably everything influences. It's, I'm the amalgam of everything that I've ever experienced. But I was a news anchor, which meant that twice a day for 5 minutes on KMMT Mountain Radio, the radio station from Mammoth Mountain, California, right? Population at the time was probably 2,000. Twice a day for 5 minutes, I got to report the lost dogs.
Part 1. Unlocking authenticity. The power of being yourself.
I might say something that is unique, but I think what I'm going to say probably will not be helpful, even though it's unique, but I don't think it'll be helpful. And that is that I don't believe that there are klalim for speaking. I don't believe that there are guidelines that everyone should follow. Adrabah, what I've found over the years is that when I listen to a speaker, I can usually detect if that person was trained to speak, and often I can tell you who trained them. You're an exceptional speaker. But if I took your advice and followed your guidelines, I would end up being a second-class version of Daniel Steinberg. Because I'm not Daniel Steinberg. I can never do Daniel Steinberg as well as Daniel Steinberg does Daniel Steinberg. And when we train our guys to speak, we do so by not training them. So to merit that, I tell them that I want them to first have something inside of themselves. I don't want them to concentrate on presentation. I want them to concentrate on being a piece of Torah. So before any of our guys gets up to speak, they have to be able to look me in the face and say that I spent more than 40 hours. That's the magic number. I spent more than 40 hours researching this particular vort that I'm going to give over. I do not allow anyone in our kollel, when they're preparing Divrei Torah, to look at Achronim. because then they would just be copying some achron. I want them to dig and discover. The only Makoros they're allowed to use are Bavli, Yerushalmi, Medrash, Zohar, and Rishonim. Nothing else. And if it's mefurish in any of those Makoros, then that topic is off limits because somebody already worked it out for them. I want them to experience Kiddush. I want them to dig and to discover and to have the excitement of unraveling a piece of Torah. Once they do that, oh, and of course, everything has to be mevusas and mucharach. There has to be a makor for every single thing that they say. Now, they can put the pieces together then to assemble this insight, this chiddush. But there has to be a makor for everything, and it has to fit tight, and their conclusion has to be mucharach. It can't be that, listen, there's two possible explanations for everything that you just brought us in terms of data. There's two possible explanations. It could be this or that, and I'm going to say like this. No, that's not a vort. The vort is, I'm going to show you that what I'm saying is the muchrach conclusion you would have to come through to, given the makoros that I'm bringing. And if after 40 hours of research, somebody doesn't have something that's muvusas and muchrach, that's okay. Much better not to open your mouth. Don't talk. Wait until you've discovered something that's true. Put in another 40 hours. That's Beseder Gemor. Agav, I haven't had someone have to do that. After 40 hours, they have something. One of our guys spoke today, and he said over a Chiddush, I've never heard or seen any place. He brought about 50 Makoros, demonstrating that there's a klal that we all know that the first time that something appears in the Torah is the definition of that thing. So if you want to see what the definition of something is, look at the first time it appears in the Torah. That's a well-known klal. We find in the Rishonim, we find in the Achronim. He said, I forget how many times, but it's dozens and dozens of times, we find things in sevens, whether it's the number of days are seven, or the number of lights on a menorah is seven, or like there are all sorts of different sevens. Lechem Apanim with something on top of it is 6 + 1. Anyways, he said, if you understand what happens on the first day of Bereshis, and on the second day of Bereshis, and on the third day of Bereshis, you can explain what is happening in each one of these sevens. And then he went through and he showed it in 20 different places, completely unrelated, and it was his chiddush. And he showed you exactly, whenever it's the third thing out of seven, this is always what you'll be looking at. And the fifth thing of seven is always this. That's something he discovered. So that was bubbling inside of him. When the Talmud has something that's alive inside of them, then you don't need them. You don't need to tell them, and you should be excited about this. They're on fire with their chiddush. And I explained to them, don't talk to the crowd. Tell me your chiddush. And that's what every single person in front of you is saying. Tell me your chiddush. So there's no science here. Just sit across from the person in front of you and open up and let it out. And don't be embarrassed to be yourself. Just be yourself. I did do one thing with our guys, because many of our guys were sort of sealed at the time that they came to the kollel. They were embarrassed to be themselves. So I put all of our guys through the Dale Carnegie course. And the Dale Carnegie course really like cracked them open so that they could then not be nervous about being themselves. But once they were not nervous about being themselves, and of course, Dale Carnegie doesn't tell you, you must present like this or like this. He doesn't have a style that he tells you to present in. He just gives you the courage to be yourself. So our guys get up, and we haven't had a guy rappel through the window as I once did, but we have had guys jump up on chairs, but not because they ever heard that I jumped on a table. They just got so excited. And they were so excited, they jumped on a chair. I've had people run around a room. I've had people walk over to an audience member and grab them by the collar. But it's coming from who they are. They're not trying to perform. That's not what's happening. And if they were sitting with their chavrusa, they would be doing the exact same thing. They're just being themselves. And they've got a fire burning inside of them, and I give them permission to let it out. I would be very, very upset if two of our guys ended up with the same speaking style. And so far, that has not happened once. And I've run dozens of guys through our program. I've never had two guys who came out with the same speaking style, and I'm very, very proud of that. And it's because I don't believe in giving them a style of speaking. I don't tell them how to structure a talk. I don't have, right? Just make sure that you know it, and that by the time that it's done, I believe it. And it's muvusas and muchrach. Yeah, that's all I care about. Now, can move on. Obviously, if you're speaking to a yeshivish crowd, muvusas and muchrach means one thing. If you're speaking to a crowd that's entirely fry, then muvusas and muchrach means something else. But everybody wants something that's mivusas and muchrach. They all want something that is thoroughly rooted in reality, and that they came to hear something that's true. Show them that this is true. Not that maybe, perhaps. Show them it's true. And if it's maybe, perhaps, then why do you have a right to my hour? I have lots of things that I have to do during this hour. Why do you have a right to talk to me if you're not going to tell me something that's true? Go back and learn some more. When you have something that's true, come and talk to me.
Yeah.
So again, I'm saying something I think which is unique insofar as it's not the typical speaking advice that people would give, but I don't think it's helpful because so I'm telling you nothing. Just be yourself.
Right. So let me go back because I have a couple of questions. I guess the first question I have is, what kind of talk are we discussing? Where someone will put 40 hours into it, and is this an exercise for a shiur? Is this a drasha? Is it where does this fit in? What type of talk are we discussing?
Yes.
Anything. So you advocate putting in as much time as humanly possible till the token bubbles up inside of you, and you let it out in an authentic, genuine type of way.
And these guys are beginners, so I don't ask them for more than 40 hours. But I don't give talks anymore where I prepare for 40 hours. My talks today, they're probably in the hundreds, maybe even the thousands of hours. I'll think about something for many, many years and take notes until I've put together all the pieces. It's probably hundreds or thousands of hours. But for a beginner, okay, at least think about something for 40 hours before you open your mouth. Again, I think a premise for my approach to speaking, for my approach to teaching bichlal, is something that I mentioned agav, which is you don't have a right to my time unless you have something that's true and an insight for me. Like, otherwise, why am I listening to you? So if someone hasn't thought about something for 40 hours, like, are you kidding? Why do you have a right to speak? And the goal is not to entertain. That's not the goal. I remember when someone explained to me that this concept of edutainment. Today, everything has to be edutainment. I refuse. I think it's degrading. And if someone wants to be entertained, so why do they have to listen to you? Let them go watch a movie on Netflix. Yeah. If they're listening to you, tell them something that's true. You mentioned the talk about my son. So that was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of life that was burned into my brain and dripped into my heart. When I got up to speak, there were no notes. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, and then the chazor of thinking what just happened, and oh my goodness, and then a year later looking back and saying, like, how many nisim were there exactly? And I had no interest whatsoever in entertaining an audience. Something significant happened. I understood the significance of what happened, and because of that, there was a certain level of energy I was trying to give over. This was significant. Like, this was significant. So that's what you saw. But it wasn't edutainment, chas v'chalila.
Yeah. So the other question I have is, when you talk about mukhrach, something has to be compelling and it has to be tight, it has to be cogent and fit the message has to fit the substance. So where is there room in your mind, or is there, for drush, for an idea that is maybe you could call it a Hasidic Torah, or maybe you just call it drush. That it's not the pshat, but it is a message that emerges, and it's, you could call it an asmachta, you could call it some association with the words, with the tochen, but it's not the pshat, but the message is true.
Good. So if you want, then spend 30 minutes showing me that this yesod is true. I don't know that it's true. Well, first of all, if I already know that it's true, then don't bother talking to me, because I already know, so you're wasting my time. If I don't know that it's true, you have a chiddush. So spend 30 minutes showing me that this thing, which I didn't realize, is really true. Then for 15 minutes, you want to show me that this thing that's really true, it might be happening there, it might be happening there, it might be happening there, and it might be happening over there. Okay, fascinating. That would be interesting. But first, show me that it's true. That's what I mean, mukhrach. It has to be that it's true. Then you, like in a smach, you want to show me maybe that's what Aaron had in mind when he was looking back on what happened to his sons. Okay, maybe. But that's not the raya. The raya is what you brought me during the first 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in hearing someone say, I have an idea and I could fit this idea into something in the Torah. That was tried. It's called reform. And it didn't work out well. The reform and the conservative movements have almost disappeared. And they will disappear eventually, because sheker ein l'reglaim. I have an idea. I'm not interested. Give me something that's true. By the way, I'm not just talking about something that's Bavli, Yerushalmi, Medrash, Zohar, and Rishonim. You want to give a lecture about COVID vaccines, Beseder Gemur, but make it Mukhrach and Mevusas. Tell me something that is for sure true. I don't want to hear your idea that maybe, like that's irresponsible. In the secular realm, just like in the religious realm, there's such a thing as truth. Your listeners deserve to hear that.
Now, you mentioned before that if you have an idea that I already know, why do I need to listen to you? But maybe someone would argue that there's divrei chizuk. Things need reinforcement. People need to be reminded of things, or sometimes people are in a rut and they know the truth. They just needs to be brought to their attention again and again and again. Where is the room for those types of maybe motivational messages, inspirational messages that there may not be a chiddush necessarily, but it's packaged in a way that motivates someone, that lifts up their mood.
Excellent. Okay.
Moves the needle.
That's very, very interesting. And I believe that there is such a thing. I believe that it's possible to understand something intellectually and not wrap your heart around it, not have it internalized. And very often, a visual can help somebody internalize something, and a good speaker could create such a visual. There's a story, I'll give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. There's a story about a fellow who was about to attempt suicide. And he was standing mamash outside the window when a talented social worker who was part of the police unit for dealing with suicides showed up. And the police and the police psychologist had already failed to talk the person off the edge. And the social worker walked in, understood the situation. She was very clever. She said, just keep him from jumping for another 10 minutes. And she left the room. She came back 10 minutes later with a watermelon. She leaned out the window. She said, excuse me, and she dropped the watermelon. And the guy came back in. Yesh davar kazeh. Sometimes you think you understand something intellectually, but you haven't wrapped your heart around it. And sometimes it's helpful to wrap your heart around it. And a good speaker might be able to help with something like that. I believe that that's true. And I would also consider that to be something that's a chiddush, and it's definitely mibusas and muchrach. There's no question. It's true. There is no other explanation. That is what happens when you jump. There's no other explanation. It's clear. And all she really did was say, this is your choice. Without words. So I do believe that there is such a thing.
Part 2. The one thing we can't get anywhere else is you. Give us what you got.
One of the guests that I had on the podcast said that he was demurring when I asked him about, should every speaker aim for a chiddush? Should a speaker aim for a chiddush?
I once had a day with Maurice Lamb. They used to offer this to young rabbis, and you could ask Rabbi Maurice Lamb whatever you wanted. So he spent some of the day talking about drushes. So he asked me how I come up with a drusha. So I said, well, I look through the Parsha, look at Rashi's and Ramban, the basic Rishonim, and I try to think, whatever. And he looks at me like I'm from Mars. And he says, come here. And he brings me back to his study, this massive wall of drushas farm with little things coming out of it. They didn't have Post-it notes then, just little whatever's sticking out of everything. And he said, with all due respect, these people have much better ideas than you do, which is true.
Yeah.
Why would you give them lower quality ideas that are yours instead of the best things that have ever been written just because you're not the author?
Now, I recognize that the process of coming up with the chiddush is really what makes you bubble over with your Torah, and that connects you with the audience you're speaking to. But what about that? What would you say about that argument? How do you contend with that?
If someone said that argument to the Malbim, what do you think he would say? He shouldn't say his chidushim? How about if someone said that to the Maharal? He shouldn't say his chidushim? How about if somebody said that to the Marshah or the Rif or the Rush? They shouldn't say their chidushim? I don't understand. We are saying we don't want to deprive them of the chidushim of these dead people. But I'm still alive. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent me to this world. I have something unique to give that nobody else has to give. And so I should say, no, I'm not going to give that. Then why am I here? When I first met Rav Wolbe, I had Gagui Malav. Mamish was crazy over him. And I did something very foolish. I was young. I was very immature. I loved him so much that I started copying things that he did. I think most of the copying I did unconsciously. I don't think I really realized what I was doing, but I was copying him in ridiculous ways. And in terms of Chitzoni style. And at a certain point, he turned to me and he said, Rabbi Leib, I don't understand. The Ribbono Sholem already had me. Why did he make you? That's very, very powerful. Here, in the Ale Shor Chelik base, I hope it's okay if I look at a sefer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In Ale Shor Chelik base, where he's talking about what is a human being. So Rav Wolbe says like this. This is on page Ayin Aleph. This is the answer to your question. He says, Kol Adam hu bria chad pamit. Every human being is a one-time creation. V'yeda zos kol Adam. Every human being has to know this. Ani, I, im kochosai v'tchunosai, with my potentials, with my traits, partzuf panai, with my profile, v'segulos nafshi, and with the unique aspects of my soul. Yichidi ba'olam. I'm totally unique in this world. Ve'in kol achai makshav, amongst all those who are alive today, ein af echad kamoni. There is not a single person on the planet like me. B'dor she'avru, in all the generations that have passed, lo haya kamoni. There was never anyone like me. Vad sof koladoros lo yeh kamoni, and until the end of generations, there will never be anyone like me. If that's the case, bevadai, certainly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu shalchani leolam b'shlichus miyuchedet. HaKadosh Baruch Hu must have sent me to this world on a mission. Sheshum acher eni yacholim losa, that no other person could possibly fulfill. Rakani, only me. B'chad pami osai, with my one-timeness, with my uniqueness. And you're going to tell me that I shouldn't say my chidushim? Did the Ribbono Shalom agree to that? He doesn't want people to say their chidushim either? Why did he send us here? My goodness. Yoter mizeh. If somebody doesn't know a marsha, and the marsha is crucial for understanding what I want to explain, the Seder Gemara, I'm going to explain the marsha. If I'm stam sitting and learning Gemara, so I'm going to explain Ravina and I'm going to explain Rav Ashi. But when it comes time to open up somebody's eyes, I have an hour, 45 minutes. I don't believe in people speaking for an hour. I have 45 minutes to say over something. Don't you want to hear the Maharal say the Maharal, and the Marsha say the Marsha, and Leib say Leib? Would the world be better if I never said my chidushim?
Got it. Okay. That was mukhrach, as they said. So let me ask you about Rav Wolbe for a moment, because I know you're a Talmud of his, and I once had the opportunity to meet him right when I got married. I went to go buy Hadracha Lechasanim, and you could only buy it at his house. And I was very surprised that when I knocked on the door, that he opened the door, and he ushered me in, and he sat me down when he went to go pull it off his shelf or wherever it was. And I said, in my broken Hebrew, I'd just come off the boat, and I said, I received a lot of chizik from your svarim. And he said, "Nu." That was it. And they asked for the money, and then ushered me out. But it was a very, he was very an awe-inspiring figure. And I'm curious in terms of how he spoke. I know he gave many Vaadim, maybe things that you learned from him in terms of how you would adopt your methodologies, or non-methodologies, as you say.
This is so powerful, your question. The whole discussion between you and me today was worth it for that question.
Are you tired of the same old lecture programs that feel more like a snooze fest than a stimulating discussion? Picture this: an event filled with laughter.
One of the funniest men I've seen in many years is right here, Steinberg. He's the guy.
Inspiration and invaluable insights straight from the mouths of over 60 congregational leaders.
It was really well done. It was really well done.
We're talking about a lecture that dives deep into the art of crafting and delivering sermons.
In my mind, every rabbi sits down and writes a speech on Friday, but it's not true.
Packed with incredible stories, hilarious jokes, and public speaking techniques that I've gleaned from my interviews with over 60 of the best pulpit rabbis and public speakers today.
Educational, fun, but also kind of practical, because I also learned some lessons from it.
But hold on. This isn't your typical scholar-in-residence affair. This is a dynamic fusion of stand-up comedy.
There was a lot of humor in the presentation.
Man was extremely funny.
Everybody was laughing. Nobody was bored.
Jewish history and pulpit wisdom from over 60 rabbis that promises to keep the audience engaged from start to finish.
There were a lot of questions. Everybody tried to keep Rabbi Steinberg longer.
If you're ready to experience the most inspirational, educational, and downright entertaining lecture,
found it not only funny but very relatable,
you won't want to miss out on this opportunity to put on a one-of-a-kind event. Email daniel@maggidmethod.com for availability and booking information. Email Daniel at maggidmethod.com. This is one program your members won't soon forget.
You need to go, is what I would say.
Now back to the program.
This is so powerful, your question. The whole discussion between you and me today was worth it for that question. When Rav Wolbe gave Avad, he spoke like this, in as close to a monotone as could be imagined. with long spaces in between for you to think. He used to play a game with the audiences. Very often at the base of Mussar, he would say over concept, and then he would go silent. And the silence would sometimes be for a full minute, sometimes longer, minute and a half. When he started speaking again, if you were just looking at the words that were said, there was no connection between the words that were said and what he was talking about now. Because Rav Wolbe expected that you watched him take step 1, 2, and 3, and he wanted you to be engaged. So he would go silent and allow you on your own to continue thinking. If you keep thinking, you would realize step 4, which would lead you to step 5, which would lead you to step 6, and then he would start speaking at step 7. At the beginning, if you didn't know the game, you were completely lost. Once you learned the game, so then it was the most exciting speaking style in the world. I don't know why he spoke in such a monotone. I never asked him. But he did tell me that he felt that I was too animated and that there was a danger that the students would try to be like me. That my style would overwhelm them, and therefore they wouldn't be able to become themselves. He told a story about his teacher, Rabbi Levavitz, who, this is going to sound strange, but Baruch Hashem, I never heard him speak. Because I read his Sfarim, and after he spoke, I couldn't accept any other pshat. He was so powerful that if I would have ever heard him speak, Leib Kelemen would have disappeared. I wouldn't have existed. Rabbi Levavitz once went back to see Reb Simcha Zissel Zayv, the Alter of Kelm, his Rebbe. And no one knows exactly what took place in the room. But the Talmidim outside kept hearing the Alter of Kelm say, "You're creating little Rabbi Yerucham Cossacks." It was makpid because Rabbi Yerucham was so charismatic, he was so powerful that he destroyed people's individuality in the early years. Eventually, obviously, he learned how to bring out people's individuality. And I don't know if maybe he did it by speaking like Rav Wolbe or not, but Rav Wolbe did not get in the way of someone's individuality. You know that if you've met the Talmidim of Rav Wolbe, every single one of them came out totally unique, different, thinking completely differently, trying to do completely different things. Totally different style, Pitzonius, Pneumius, everything different. And I think Rav Wolbe did that by being invisible. He spoke in a monotone, very slowly, lots of time for you to think. If someone would take Rav Wolbe's example of how to speak, we would say no one will come and listen to them. Although thousands of people used to come and listen to Rav Wolbe.
Yeah, I recall a lecture by Shir by Reb Revda, and I can't remember who he was referring to, but he said there was one of the maybe it was Kelm, where there was a Maggid Shir, and he would speak in a monotone like you described, and for hours, and the purpose was that the style of speaking shouldn't detract from the tochen. That you had to, it was like a Mussar exercise, that you had to train yourself to not get sleepy, to be fully engaged, and just for the tochen and not for the style of the speaking. And I forget who it was. I went back and I tried to find the lecture, but they're and I just think about, would that work in our door? And the answer is, I think, a resounding no. So which leads me to my next question is how do you deal with attention spans today, and let's say if it's not a Shabbos, with the digital diversions, people have phones and things like that. How do you personally deal with that when you speak somewhere, and how do you teach your students to navigate that?
Good question. Okay, so to some degree, I do create a synthetic guideline that I would advise my Talmidim, and here I'm gonna go back on what I said previously. I do create a guideline which has nothing to do with the essence of the person, that will help with attention span, which is that I don't believe that today the vast majority of people can listen to a person speak for longer than 45 minutes. In fact, I think no one can listen to someone longer than 45 minutes. And the ideal is in the 20 to 30 minute range. People just have difficulty listening longer than that. So that means you can't say over, obviously, 5 hours of information in 20 minutes. It can't be done. But you can break up a 5-hour presentation into lots of little 20-minute bites, each pouring forth from your heart, clearly structured, comprehensible, so that they can fully engage for 20 minutes. That's part one. And part two is the exact opposite of what I just said. I just gave you a guideline that I think does apply to everybody. Now I'll go back to the individuality. I believe that a human being who is being him or herself is captivating. And that alone, just hearing somebody be themselves, will grab everyone's attention. There's a problem if people are embarrassed to be themselves. Then they can actually become so contained that people can't access them. And okay, that's boring because there's no one there. But if you'll allow people to be themselves, to really like let loose and be themselves, ain't more interesting than that. That's like as good as it gets. So I would keep it to less than 20, 30, maximum 45 minutes. And then again, teach people just to be unique.
So I'm very curious, how does the Dale Carnegie program achieve that? How does it break down, I guess, the inhibitions that a person has that allows them to be authentic and present with their audience in front of them, when public speaking is I think they say it's the number one fear. So how does that work?
They force them to talk in front of their peers and sometimes to say things that are very personal, and sometimes to say it in ways that are very embarrassing. But it's yourself, so you have to learn to be comfortable with yourself. It takes, I can't summarize Dale Carnegie in a minute, but it takes several months. They meet once a week with them, and each meeting is long. Each meeting is like 3 hours. And they break down the barriers of embarrassment and hesitancy that people have. At a certain point, the guys are just like, okay, like there's nothing else that I'm afraid to do, so I might as well just be myself now. And that we've seen over and over again, and it makes a big difference with our guys. I see, like, I can tell who the guy is by the test that we give them before we bring them in. We do personality analysis. We do all sorts of analyses to see who the guy is. But it's all beremes. And then after the Dale Carnegie course, it's like in full bloom.
Wow. So I'm curious also about, in terms of relevancy of topics, when you give a shir, when you give a drasha, how directly relevant do you advise people to make it? Because obviously, if a person understands what's in it for me, or how it relates directly to me, how it's going to improve my life, or how I'm going to be able to see things differently in a more positive way than when I came in, that's obviously something that's compelling to me. I'm going to continue watching. I think a big a big obstacle for people is they're listening to a speaker and they're like, what does this have to do with me? It's nice, Torah is profound, but it doesn't really have any bearing directly on my life. So how do you address that issue?
We all know that what you're saying is true, but I'll give you a Torah core for it. The Pesach Seder starts with Arba Kushiot, which then leads to Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the halacha is that if somebody spontaneously asks, like, what are these crackers? What are we doing here? You skip the 4 questions and you go straight to Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. So what do you see? The 4 questions aren't necessary. The 4 questions are put in there in case nobody else asks. But there's a halacha that you see here that you can't answer the question, Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, if the person doesn't have the question. So first there has to be a question, only then can you give an answer. A question creates a spiritual file inside of a person that then can accept the answer. And if the question isn't there, so then when you try to provide the answer, it'll just bounce off. The person didn't have the question in the first place. They're bichlal not interested in what I have to say. That's why I think the minig started that every good Dvar Torah would always start with a question, because we don't assume that people in the audience necessarily have my question. So we build the question, and we build it, and we build it. In our Kola, we describe it, you build the question until the person's belly is popping with the question. They can't stand it any longer. They want to run over and grab you and say, tell me the answer. At that point, there's a giant keli just waiting to accept the answer. And at that point, you can provide it to them. And there's a danger if you don't do this. If the person doesn't have the question and you provide an answer, so it bounces off, but their intellect heard the answer. Then years later, they may actually develop the question on their own. Then Nebuch, some well-intentioned person, comes and gives them that answer, which I gave them prematurely many years early. And they say, no, I've already heard that. Give me a real answer. What happened was I inoculated them against the answer because I gave it before they had the question. So it's crucial that when I speak to somebody, I'm speaking to them about either a question that they walked in with or a question which I spent a fair amount of time with them developing until they say, yeah, like I'm bothered. What is the answer to that? But one way or another, you have to create this vacuum inside of them that's going to accept that answer.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never thought about it being detrimental. I know one of my pet peeves is when I see a speaker raise a kasha and then, no one had that kasha to begin with and no one really cares about it yet, and then they, in a magical flourish, they answer the question for everybody, and it's way too early. But I never thought about it as being detrimental, and that to me is quite fascinating. But even taking a step back, who's to say that your question actually will bother them? Maybe you could build up a question, a kitsos or on Hilchos Shomrim or something like that. Something that could be, I don't know, maybe esoteric to the audience. How do you make sure that the question is a question that if you take the effort to build it up, that they actually want to know about?
So let me ask a different question.
Yeah.
I need to buy applesauce. How do I know when I go out to buy applesauce I'm going to find it? So the answer is that, first of all, I find all the different kinds of stores that carry applesauce. I'm not going to walk into a hardware store. And then I might call that store and say, like, do you have applesauce? When I go to speak someplace, so the first question I always ask is, who are they? What's the demographic? If based on that, I can't figure out the sorts of things that are bothering them right now, then I'll say, what's going on in your community? Tell me what people are bothered by. What are the hot topics? Where's their confusion? There are certain areas where you can pretty much assume in this generation, there is massive confusion and frustration. And then you dive into that area, you're going to get people hanging off the edge of their chair. But even there, you can make a mistake. I once went to speak, actually didn't go to speak. What happened was I was doing a book tour in New York, and someone called me on the phone and said, please, we have a place in New York where there's Jewish talks, and we have an empty spot. And is there any chance we could get you to come down on this night and speak? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to come. And they said, could you talk about relationships? So I said, sure. And this was in Manhattan. This is also going back a ways, but I don't know if the situation has changed in this regard too much. When I showed up, forget about standing room only in this facility that they had. There were people all the way down the stairs, and there was a giant crowd outside, and they were setting up speakers outside for a talk on relationships, because people in Manhattan were hanging on the edge of their seat to find out something about relationships. So I was naive and misguided, And I gave my chidushim on relationships, assuming that that was their question. And 10 minutes into the talk, it was a crazy scene. It was so crowded you cannot imagine. There's people standing on top of people, standing on top of people. 10 minutes into the talk, someone stopped me and said, Rabbi Kelemen, you don't understand. We know how to date. We don't know how to get married. And everyone in the room started cheering. I missed the question. I didn't understand what their real question was. And it was a terrible matzav. It was an entire community on the Upper West Side that were experts at dating and could not take the next step and get there. And they watched their lives going up in flames in front of them and didn't know how to solve the problem. So sometimes even what you think is the obvious question is not the question. And I learned that night.
So do you advise, how do you advise students to prepare to ask the coordinator of wherever they're speaking or in front of?
Minimally ask the coordinator, what is the demographic? What are these people struggling with? What is going on in your community right now? What do they know? What do they don't know yet? And then perhaps I'm not the right person. And I'm so happy to say, like, I don't know anything about that. And I haven't put in the time to give you a quality answer. So I don't need the speaking engagement. I'm very happy for you to bring somebody else in. We have to remember that speaking to Klal Yisrael is not a career. As Rav Wolbe said, it's a mission. I was sent here to share Har Sinai with them. And if I don't have the answer to their question, then what am I wasting their time for? I don't need a speaking engagement. No speaker needs a speaking engagement. That's not the way that it works. This is not a career. Bichlal, there's a whole question. How do you ever take money for this?
Let me ask you, in terms of, let's use the previous example as relationships. And let's say you had gotten it right in terms of the specific area of topic. How much time would you distribute between the Torah sources, the tochen, and the takeaway, the lesson and the message? How do you make it so that it's not lopsided in any one direction? That if it's too intellectual and too many makoros, people are just going to lose interest. But on the other side, you don't want it to be like I guess some personal development or a motivational type of speech. You want it to emerge, and you want it to be, like you said, mukhrach and mavusas. But what is there some type of ratio or average that you aim for?
So what I would like to do when I go to speak to them is I want to share with them the process of discovery that I experienced. So my process of discovery is always a shiluv of looking at reality, the physical chitzonius, the reality in front of me, and looking at Torah sources and trying to understand what do the Torah sources say about this reality that's sitting in front of me. In the same way that Yoreh Deah talks about this pot and this spoon. So I have to study the reality and I have to study the Torah sources. And my goal then is to tell them, when I was going through this, I was bothered by this, and I was bothered by this, and I was bothered by this. Build the question until their belly is popping, right? Show them, like, this bothered me. Does this bother you? And I would say, spend as much of the talk as necessary to build the question to the point where they're like, yes, we're bothered. We want to know. Okay, now we have a keli. Now I can give them something. As I start to explain the answer, so to the extent that they distrust what I have to say and won't believe that it's from a Torah source, then I have to show them inside this is from a Torah source. To the extent that they say, you're an Orthodox rabbi, we know what's coming from Torah, then all I have to say is, and really this is a concept from the Marsha, and then go on and explain the concept. And that leads directly to this Ritva. What the Ritva says opens up our eyes. And I'm not necessarily quoting verbatim every single word. They trust me. Yeah, they don't need to see it inside. The point that you raised is so powerful. I do require, again, you keep catching me in contradictions, as I said, there's no klalim, but I do require that every one of the vortlock that's given in our kollel ends with a nafkamina lamaisa. The reason I say that is, if I want to destroy a question, if I'm fighting with my chavrus and he keeps battering me with a question, and I want to destroy his question, I can come up with an answer to the question, or I can do something else. I can say my nafkamina. If there's no nafkamina, then it's not Torah. So go away. All Torah is practical. Torah milashon hora, says the Reshis Chachma. So if it's not practical, then why are we talking? So there has to be something practical from the end. And Yoter Mizeh, Rav Wolbe said that a segula for remembering Torah is learn it all the way out to the halacha. Once you actually get to the halacha l'maisa, then that's sort of like the package that will hold all the Torah that you just learned and enable you to take a souvenir home with you. So therefore, every vort has to end with, and if everything that I said is true, this is how it's going to change your life. You have to live this way. You can't live this way anymore. Don't you see? We all agreed on everything that led up into this. How could you do this? You've got to do this. And of course, that's also very exciting for the Talmidim, because they're not just taking home a souvenir. Their life is exalted. It's elevated as a result of the hour that they're 45 minutes they spent.
Part 3. Building structure through strong desire.
Yeah, amazing. So I'm curious, you say that there's no real structure or it's really just something that should emerge out of you, as if you're just speaking to a person. But we know that people have a hard time following things if they're not misudar, if they're not laid out in a way that is easy to follow. People will lose you, and even if you're speaking one-to-one. So is there some direction that you give the Talmidim to, in maybe single point, and don't try to make too many points, don't take makoros in too many different directions? How do you balance that?
So again, the limit is only going to be the amount of time you've got. If you've got 20 minutes, you're not going to make it through 50 makoros. It's not going to happen. And you're not citing makoros for the sake of citing makoros. If you cite a makor, it's because that makor contains an essential idea. It's going to take me time to explain that idea. So, as I start to make this presentation, I'm going to realize in 20 minutes, this is as far as I'm going to get. And in terms of being misudar, so one of the things that is crucial to a teacher is a teacher has to have a very strong ratzon. You can't be like, well, whatever, however things work out, it's all okay. You have to have a ratzon. You have to have a vision of the way that the world should look. A clear vision of the way that the world, and I want the world to look that way. The stronger somebody's ratzon is, memela, the more misudar they are. There's a direct link between ratzon, between having a strong will and being highly structured. If you see someone who's not structured, you're not looking at someone who's not structured. You're looking at someone who has weak ratzon. And trying to teach them to be more structured is not going to help, because they really couldn't care less. We say, Mussar es kochavim b'mishraseim kirtzono. The level of Hashem's sidur in the world, the level of the structure of the organization we see, is a reflection of his ratzon, which is infinite. Therefore, there's infinite levels of structure in the world. So I don't try to develop seder in my Talmidim. I try to develop ratzon, which creates real seder in the Talmidim, extraordinary structure. Again, what I'm doing is I'm working on the pnimius, which will then memela produce a certain chitzonius.
You're saying the ratzon really, focus emerges out of the ratzon.
Focus and seder, like this. If I have a vision, I want everyone in the room to walk out fully convinced of this. But if I skip this step, then they're going to get lost. They're not going to be fully convinced of this. So I have to put this in right before, which means I have to put this in right before, which means I have to put this in right before. Otherwise, I'm not going to get what I want, which is that. Again, look at how people live their lives. People who have very strong ratzon, someone who wants to get very wealthy, someone who wants to win an athletic event. Look at their life. It's super structured because Ratzon always produces structure. Memela. You don't have to tell somebody to become structured. Just develop a very strong Ratzon.
And how do you work on the Ratzon? How do you develop that?
So the first thing you do is tell them, listen, after 120 years, you're going to lay down on the ground. What do you want your life to have looked like? You have a picture of it. What do you want people to say about you? What do you want on your tombstone, so to speak? Okay, they'll come up with a big picture. Like, I want on my tombstone, I want it to say that I was the greatest tour guide ever. Okay, great. So in order for you to become the greatest tour guide ever, what would you need? So I would need communication skills, and I need to have an imagination so I can describe things to people. And I would, okay. If you wanted to develop communication skills, what would you have to do? If you wanted to develop, right, and you work it all the way back until you get to, okay, what does your week have to look like? Let's talk about, you've only got 7 days in a week. You need this much sleep, you told me. What is your week going to look like in order for you a month from now to be where you want to be, which will then lead you a year from now, and which will lead to 120, and you just keep working backwards until, okay, so what are you supposed to be doing right now? Concentric circles.
Mm-hmm. And then it just becomes a matter of staying consistent, of keeping that Ratzon alive.
So once I have a vision of what I want, I'll be crazy about it. This is not your dream. This is my dream. And I don't want to give that up, right? Again, I'll take a gross physical example. A guy in Harvard Business School, and you say to him, what do you want? So he says, I want to be wealthy. No. Wealthy, that's too vague. What do you want? Do you want a super yacht? You want mansions in 5 countries? Yeah. Let him be dribbling over the vision of this thing that he wants. Now, you want it that badly? Okay, let's start working backwards. And now this vision is actually becoming real. I could actually have that. Okay, so now most people in life don't want to be Bill Gates and Elon Musk. Most people don't want that. But if you allow people to dream, there are things that they really do want. I would love to know Torah so well that I could sit and have a chavrusa with God and I would be holding. Or I would love to be very close to my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren. I would love to have a marriage which brings me joy at every moment. Like, there are things that people really want. Like, and sometimes it just takes imagination. Like, I had an advantage, a real advantage. I was able to serve as a chaplain in the Cedar Sinai Hospice for 3 years. So it's a merit. I only spent time with people who were going to die, and I did it for 3 years. Wow, what a chinuch. And those people at the end had a very clear vision of what they wanted. Many of them didn't have it. They had forgotten that they were going to die, and they never pursued it. But if you can get somebody in touch with the reality that it's going to end, and what are you going to want on that day, that can open them up and they can dream a little bit. I taught my children, they were growing up. They know this mantra: dream and dream big. Ask anyone, dream big. They'll all tell you. My Talmidim say it now: dream and dream big. I just got an email from one of my Talmidim in America. He said, I'm dreaming and I'm dreaming big, and I wanted to ask you something.
Yeah.
So if it's their dream, they'll be on fire for it.
All right. Shkoch, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. You've provided so much wisdom and experience, and I'm sure it's going to be very useful. So I'll be back in touch afterwards. So where can I point people? Where can I direct people who want to learn more about you, about the Kollel? What's the best addresses? Your website, the Kollel's website?
LawrenceKelemen.com. Send them there.
Okay. Wonderful. All right, Shkoch, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I've learned so much.
It was nice to meet you, Dan.
Okay, likewise.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. There's a secret that great public speakers know. Did you know there's a method for cutting straight through to an audience's heart, grabbing their attention and holding it, and making a memorable impact with your presentation? The best speakers in the world utilize it, and now you can too, every time you get up to speak. Download your free Maggid Method of Public Speaking template at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. The Maggid Method will teach you how to find your authentic voice, craft meaningful presentations, manage people's attention, and build unbreakable bonds with your audience. Go to maggidmethod.com and download your free copy now. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.